Welcome to Type and Typography Lecture 4, Wordmarks and Brand Identity. This lecture explores how wordmarks function within the broader ecosystem of a brand identity, how designers use letter forms as logos to distill personality, trust, and recognition into a single word. This lecture is about when a typeface or type becomes the face of a brand, and how strategy, consistency, and craft can transform something like a word mark into a lasting symbol of brand voice and vision. A glossary of terms to help you synthesize what we're about to discuss are brand identity, logo, word mark, icon or a brand symbol, combination mark, graphic standards, and brand guidelines. At the end of this lecture, we're going to take a look at the work of Monster of Type Paula Scher. So what is the difference between a logo, a word mark, and a brand identity? A logo is a graphic symbol or a piece of design that represents a company, product, or organization. It acts as a visual identifier, and it's often a mark or a word mark used for quick recognition. So in the context of a target brand system, the totality of this would be their logo, but the elements of their logo include an icon and a word mark. A brand identity system, on the other hand, is a broader collection of visual and design elements that create a cohesive and consistent voice for a story or brand. It includes a logo, but also extends to things like type palettes, color palettes, imagery, photo treatment, illustration styles, design layouts, grids, and other elements that shape the overall perception and communication of the brand across different platforms and materials. A brand guideline is like a sandbox that we create for everybody generating assets for a brand, and it helps maintain a cohesive visual voice across assets made by a diverse body of designers. What we see here is an illustration of a combination mark. So we have the original Nike word mark drawn by Carolyn Davidson, and then the original swoosh icon. So how important is branding to the success of a brand? Well, branding shapes how customers perceive and connect with a company. It helps wherein memory and story. And a strong brand will establish recognition and differentiation, trust and credibility, an emotional connection, strong marketing foundations, and can build customer loyalty. One of my favorite cautionary tales in the lessons of branding and word marks is the EPA case study on the graphic standard system created by Chermayeff, Geismar, and Haviv. This brand guideline was implemented to bring together a diverse body of offices that were spread all across the United States, and each office sort of dealing with different issues connected to um, the environment. So, an office in one area might be dealing with noise pollution, while an office in another area is thinking about toxic waste, right? So, depending on geographically where these offices were located, they were dealing with different topics, and they needed buy-in and participation from community and businesses and other government bodies in order to protect the environment. So, EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency. But unfortunately, what was happening was all of these offices were kind of working siloed and independently, generating communications and materials and signage that did not look cohesive from one place in the country to another place in the country, which meant that if you were an American traveling through these spaces and seeing these various initiatives, you would have a harder time understanding that they all landed under the same umbrella because there was no visual system to create cohesion. And so the US government hired an agency to create a brand system that would keep all assets generated at all offices, all locations across the United States cohesive. You guys can click on the EPA case study and hear the entire story of the brand guideline, as well as the cautionary tale at the end. I wonder how many of you, before seeing this today, could tell me what EPA stood for and what EPA does. versus your ability to tell me who Nike is and what Nike does. And now you may be left wondering, why is it that I know Nike, but I don't know the Environmental Protection Agency, or that I haven't seen anything that I recognize as being cohesive and prolific? The cautionary tale lies in the EPA case study video. So you can pause here, click, and watch. Word marks. A word mark or logo type is a unique text-based typographic design for a company, institution, or product name. It's used for identification and branding purposes. So some examples of word marks would include the identities for NASA, FedEx, Coca-Cola, Zara, and Champion. And while all word marks are considered logos, not every logo is a word mark. I know it sounds a little confusing, but think about this NASA logo that we see here, which is famously referred to as the NASA worm logo. This is a word mark that serves as a logo for the entire brand. However, if we think about Apple, the thing that you're picturing right now is the Apple icon with a bite taken out of it. So that Apple logo is an icon. So we could say the same thing for icons. While icons are considered logos, not every logo is made with an icon. There are some fun things you can click through here. Animal word marks will take you to a series of examples where a designer has found opportunities to include graphic play into a word mark. So sometimes there's an opportunity to transform a single letter or even a whole word into something that is not just a word mark, but a word mark that contains within it an illustration that still functions as a letter form that helps elevate the concept. I think you guys would enjoy those. So a brand symbol or icon. A brand symbol or icon is a mark created for the identification and branding of a company or entity. It can be purely pictorial, it could be abstract, it could be a stylized version of a letter form pulled from the primary word mark, as we see with PlayStation. Some brand symbols can transcend language and become the primary mark or the logo representing the brand. Often, brand symbols are part of a larger identification system. And so you have to consider that in order for us to start associating this P and S symbol or icon with the phrase PlayStation and with the company PlayStation, we have to have been trained on this word mark for a while first. So you can't just come out of the gate with one of these and assume that it's going to work. Getting a brand to this level takes some training, some proliferation of a primary mark. Many logos and branding systems use something called a combination mark. And this is a mix of both word and symbol to represent a company or an organization. So think about brands like McDonald's, Unilever is especially unique, Domino's, Duplo, all of these things use combination marks. So in the Duplo combination mark, we may have been used to seeing the single word mark on its own, but within the brand system, there is a combination mark that can be used when appropriate. And that combination mark includes the Duplo bunny. McDonald's, we have a combination mark of the golden arches with the word mark. Domino's, the holding shape, the shape that holds the word mark, also describes what the name is referring to. So there is a domino in the Domino's pizza logo, and we recognize the square shape as a container that holds a pizza. So we have a combination mark of icon and word mark pushed together to create a holding shape and a total concept. The Unilever mark is also one that's really interesting in that the primary U for Unilever is like a blocky sans serif, but instead of giving you just the letter form, they fill it with a bunch of illustrations and objects whose style, which looks sort of brushy, thick and thin, connects to the aesthetic of the Unilever word mark. So what goes into creating a brand identity and brand guidelines? Designing a brand system is very labor intensive and it is extremely valuable to your client. It's not just making a simple mark. This process requires doing extensive research, coming up with a brand strategy, and developing a brand story. It requires some creative expertise, custom designed elements, providing variations for versatility, and there are typically many revisions and refinement. I also want to say, as we're, in the age of competing with AI, part of being successful in the world of creating brand marks and brand guidelines is really adhering to the basic rules of good logo design. One of the things we have to think about when creating a brand mark or a logo is the many ways it is going to be used, which means we have to design a mark that can live on its own, like this Nike mark, in just a single color. Things like gradients, really detailed illustrations, things like that are tough to reproduce in every case use. So think about making a neon sign or a sign cut from plexiglass or embroidery or silkscreen. All of these production methods require or come with their own set of limitations. And so I've seen some cases in recent history where students have tried to design a brand for a client. There's a lot of back and forth on revisions. And eventually the client has just plugged their concepts into ChatGPT or DALL-E and said, take this, but make it better. And then GPT, because it is a good listener and a good rule follower, starts doing the things that every designer should know, which is rendering an uncomplicated version of a logo in a single color. And then the client has come back to the student designer and told them that they're no longer needed for the project. So the students' very important human creative expertise coming up with the original concept to begin with starts to get outshined by a piece of artificial intelligence that knows how to follow good rules. So if you want to keep yourself out of that trap, remember to follow the good rules of logo design. Single color, think about the ways that it's going to be reproduced. It has to work large and big and small applications. So even in the case of Unilever, where this image starts to get really complex, they have a word mark to lean on. Same thing with Duplo. If this is too complex for some applications, they have a word mark to lean on, something very simple. McDonald's can be also be broken apart to just the simple arches or just the word mark. So we have to think of things like this. Dominoes can still be rendered in a single color, right? So all logos have to be able to be boiled down to just this very simple shape and a single color in order to work with every single production method that exists. So, what are businesses willing to pay for branding, and how does a designer determine what the branding project should be valued at? Let's look at two case studies here. So, at the top of this page, you see the before and after for the BBC logo redesign, which cost $1.8 million. And just below that, you see the Carolyn Davidson Nike wordmark that you saw sketches for on a previous slide. This logo was designed by Carolyn Davidson while she was a student for $35. Why such a huge price difference? Well, let's think about the context that these two brands live in. At the time that BBC is looking for a rebrand, it has worldwide name recognition. BBC is a broadcasting network with a strong brand, and there are lots of other networks to look at as comparatives for scale. So, how big is this business? How much money are they bringing in? How long are they going to be using this mark? How many times is it going to be reproduced? Where is it going to be visible? It's pretty easy to determine how prolific and important this brand mark is going to be to the BBC. And the designer can gauge within that how much money they have to spend on this and how much is at stake. However, in the case of Nike, at the time that Carolyn Davidson was designing the Nike logo, Nike was a performance shoe brand, which is not a thing that really existed at the time. So nobody really understood what performance shoe brand meant. Started by two gentlemen, it wasn't like a large corporation. There wasn't a whole lot in the field to compare them to, right? There weren't things like Saucony or Adidas or any of the other larger shoe brands that we know today to sort of compare. There weren't things like celebrity endorsements. Jordans didn't exist. So you couldn't really tell as a student, Carolyn Davidson could not really tell what the scale of this company was going to be, what the proliferation of the mark was going to be, how much money it was going to be bringing in, or who it was going to be competing with. Similarly, the founders of Nike didn't really know who Carolyn Davidson was other than a student in their classroom. Carolyn Davidson was a design student. She did not have a long history of design work or a portfolio full of brand work for well-known companies. And so it was sort of the mutual, I don't know who you are, I don't really understand what you're doing. Um, Vice versa, 35 bucks sounds good. You can click through the link to hear the rest of this story and see how Nike went back and made good on Carolyn Davidson's work. So, yeah, what the heck? When we look at Paul Rand, this is like my favorite comparison to the Nike logo. Paul Rand was paid $250,000 for the Next logo. How many of y'all have ever heard of the company Next? Probably not very many of you. So Paul Rand was paid $250,000 to design the Next logo for Steve Jobs in 1986. So very different scenario. Paul Rand is a brand design legend known for creating long-lasting, effective logos for companies like UPS, Westinghouse, ABC. He had a proven track record of success for the logos that he had designed for some very large companies. And Steve Jobs was well known as the founder of Apple. And so Next was the business that Steve Jobs was starting when he left Apple for a brief while. So here we have really big stakeholder, Steve Jobs, competing in a field where he's had tremendous success and made a lot of money. And you have Paul Rand, who holds sort of similar esteem in the design world. So the two of these guys come together and they're like, $250,000 sounds reasonable. So you can start to see that the dollar amounts to these things usually are connected to the scale of the company, the importance of the stakeholders, the reputation of the designer, and how prolific the brand is going to be. And so when I say prolific, I mean, how many times is this thing going to be recreated? How often are people going to see it? Right? You could walk across campus and see the Nike logo at least 50 times in a single walk. That's pretty prolific. Um, and so the other part of this story that I really love is that when you build up a reputation, the kind of reputation that Paul Rand had, and you're really highly sought after, and your work is deemed extremely valuable and high paid, you kind of can start swinging your weight around and be a little bit more sassy in your terms. So Paul Rand's terms for Steve Jobs were, I will take your $250,000. Um, you will take whatever it is that I designed for you. And if you use it, great. If you don't, I don't care. Um, that's the deal. No revisions. I make it, you take it, use it or not. Either way, I get paid $250,000. But one of the very special things that Paul Rand did do, even though those were his terms, but he was also really confident in the logo that he was delivering. He designed out the entire brand guideline book, a book that helped bring people into the process and the concept of this mark. He had them printed and then he visited the Next offices and hand delivered them to people. So people got to meet Paul Rand in person. He's a celebrity. And they were handed the brand guideline book in person. And so there's all sorts of finesse and sort of ways of doing things when you're creating brand guidelines, things that are connected to reputation, history, longevity, proven track records. But I also just love the part of the story. I think about like under promising and over delivering. So there's a little bit of an underpromise on Paul Rand's end of no revisions, you take what you get, and over delivering in, but I'm also going to put together this beautiful book and pay to get it printed and come to your office and hand deliver them to people, which felt very special. So this is the work of Louise Philly. She founded her studio in 1989. She's an award-winning New York-based graphic designer who runs a design firm with a focus on strategic brand development and packaging for specialty food products and internationally acclaimed clients. Her work is primarily type-based, often incorporating holding shapes and other graphic devices that elevate the typographic form. And so we're going to take a look at some of these images she's created here. It's also important to know that she was the mentor for Jessica Hish, who's a graphic designer who is also very well known for bespoke word marks. So this top image, when I talk about like history and track record of success and proliferation, this image is just a stack of matchboxes that Louise Philly has designed for various food-based specialty food clients. And so you can see this really deep history of successfully creating bespoke word marks and branding systems for her clients. Here's some examples of the word marks that she's created. Notice no holding shape, but we have a little drop shadow. This piece of type in a system would also be provided with stylistic alternates that do not that are keep this mark super simplified. Just the cursive writing, simple flat black text or flat black ink fill, no drop shadow, no highlights, right? So that it can be reproduced. So that might be considered, this would be um, a version of the primary mark. Our next designer is Erin Draplin. Erin Draplin is a graphic designer who is well known for creating brand marks. And these brand marks include icons and word marks. So when you look at his work, I really want you to focus on word marks and holding shapes. He was born in Detroit, Michigan, but is based out of Oregon. But I do feel like sort of the Michigan, Motor City industrial vibe is something that is visible in his work. Um, you can see to the left, he has his own seal that he made for his company, Drapeland Design Co. Um, if you click on the link, you'll get to see a whole body of his work. He also does some really great YouTube videos and Skillshare classes where he breaks down his design process for incorporating letter forms and word marks into a brand mark. So I highly recommend watching those things and learning from him. And finally, our monster of type for this lecture, Paula Scher. Paula Scher is a renowned designer, painter, and educator celebrated for her innovative work in branding and identity design. Her work is characterized by bold typography, vibrant colors, and dynamic use of space, which she says reflects on her background in fine art. Her career spans over 4 decades, and she's also contributed to the field as a lecturer, an educator, and is always inspiring new generations of designers. If you click on her picture, it'll take you to an episode of Netflix's Artifact, where you get to see more of her work, learn about her journey and her process. But she's done a lot of what every designer wants to do. She started in album artwork, so generating graphics for music. She has created a lot of editorial design, branding that is type-based for various companies. My favorite Paula Scher story was, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard it. The story is that she was called in for a meeting with Citibank, who needed a new logo after a merger. And during the meeting, as the stakeholders are describing the scope of the project and kind of what they're looking for, she gets the idea for the mark and draws it on a piece of paper. And the Citibank folks are like, well, that was easy. That was fast. Maybe we don't have to pay that much. And Paula Scher was like, this was fast and easy because I've been doing it for, I think at the time, 3 decades. It took a lot of work and skill building and muscle to get to create a mark like this quickly. So when I say muscle, I want you to think about that, right? Like if you've ever lifted weights or done any sort of um, exercise or practice or hobby. I think about skateboarding, right? Landing a kickflip. It takes a lot of time and investment to figure that skill out, to build muscle up to a place where it can lift its maximum weight and become impressive. It takes a long time to figure out how to land that kickflip. It takes a long time to learn how to not fall. And so, what makes somebody like Paula Scher so valuable is the time that she's put into her craft, the muscle that she's built in this practice that allows her to create these really valuable marks. And so I want you to think about yourself as a designer in your journey that you are building muscle, you're building a skill. And the more you invest in it, the more valuable it becomes, and the more confidently you can ask for the value of the thing that you're making. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I look forward to seeing you for lecture 6.